I'll kick this thing off by stating the obvious. And if you've been looking for a house for any time now, you already know this to be so totally true. And that is housing affordability has never been at a lower point. In other words, it has never been harder to afford a home than it is right now, at least not in like living memory, right? I know that some people will reference the 1980s and how high interest rates were then, but when we're speaking of actual like housing affordability, the relative cost of a house compared to the average household income, we are so far away from housing being like attainable or anything reasonable that it's gotten to the point of being just ridiculous. And in this episode of the DIY Homebuyer Podcast, I really want to dive into three particular areas that are contributing to this housing affordability crisis. Now, this is a complicated mess, and so I don't pretend to have the answers. And frankly, everything that I'm sharing here is informed by people who are so much smarter than me that I enjoy listening to. But I'm going to try and break it down for the everyday home buyer in hopes that this will be helpful to you as you think about your next steps, as you weigh, our house is going to become more affordable in the next few years. This is something that I should hold out on before entering into the housing market. Just creating some categories for thought, categories for further discussion. And honestly, the more that we talk about the contributing factors to housing affordability, hopefully the more productive those conversations will become. Because again, I don't know who you are and the people that you're in conversation with and what kind of local leaders or politicians you may have the ear of. But I do know that our representative governments are designed to represent the will of the people. And so if we get a critical mass of people who are thinking clearly about housing, who have ideas and opinions, and they're voicing those things and making those known, well, that's how change happens. That's how public opinion changes. That public opinion puts pressure upon political leaders. And then we can kind of get the policy changes that need to happen, in as much as housing affordability even has to do with policy. So with no further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Nick. I'm the host of the DIY Homebuyer Podcast. In general, what I'm all about is teaching homebuyers how to purchase real estate without having to hire a costly buyer's agent, because I believe that an educated consumer is the best consumer, and believe that one of the things that contributes to the housing affordability issues is that transaction fees associated with buying and selling real estate are so incredibly high, and it is very, very hard for me to imagine how a buyer's agent adds 2.5% to 3% of the purchase price in value to the transaction, which for most of my listeners ends up being somewhere in the neighborhood of $15,000 to $20,000. I just don't think that buyer's agents bring that much value, and I say that as somebody who has been a buyer's agent. So it's not just a wild claim that I'm making, but actually comes from my own professional experience. But when we talk about housing affordability, simply removing buyer's agents is not going to, it's not going to cut it. It helps, right? It gets us perhaps 3% closer, but we're going to need much larger changes if we're going to really tackle the issue of housing affordability. So let's start with even just a definition of what is an affordable home. And conventional wisdom has said that a home should be no more than like 3 times your annual income, right? So in the United States, rough math, the average household income is around $75,000. Okay. So 3 times $75,000, quick math, right? $225,000. That would be an affordable home by conventional standards. Well, the average purchase price of a home in the United States is somewhere around 360,000, depends on what numbers you're looking at, but well above that $225,000 number, which just says that, like, okay, we're nowhere close to that 3 times annual income affordability. And in fact, we are well beyond it. Like, good luck finding a quality home that you actually want to live in and have a family in for under $300,000 pretty much anywhere in America. And especially if you're living on one of the coastal cities, I mean, finding anything even under $500,000 is like, good night. It's not it's not an option, and builders cannot build houses that affordably, which really then raises the questions of, like, well, why, and what's happened, and how do we fix it? And in terms of why, there is more consensus around, like, okay, why has housing gotten so incredibly expensive? And it really does come out of the crazy financial circumstances that we had during COVID, and the way that the government stepped in during the pandemic, where people also saw how important housing was. So there's this conglomeration of, one, people are stuck at home, they're thinking about their home, they're starting to work from home, like a renewed sense of how important housing is and how much home ownership can matter. Because yes, we heard lots of stories about terrible tenants, but we also know that there's a lot of terrible landlords out there. And so during those COVID era times, people were realizing, okay, housing is really important. That also happened simultaneously as the government is printing money, giving out stimulus checks, and bringing interest rates to historic lows, so that it, is never cheaper to borrow money than it was during COVID. And that's where you hear the stories of people that are getting like 2% interest rates, locking that in for 30 years. I mean, it's like, it's absurd to think about. So you have this huge number of folks that are wanting to buy homes, limited supply of homes. Homes were it was extremely easy and affordable to borrow money for those homes. And now you've got a bunch of homeowners that, one, have seen incredible increases in equity. They either bought or refinanced when interest rates were low. And so they feel like they're very comfortable in their monthly payments. They don't have to sell. And waiting in the wings, you've got a lot of people who still would like to be homeowners, which means that there's a much higher demand than there actually is available supply. And yes, while we see across the United States, there are more active listings already, even this year compared to this time last year. That's an encouraging trend, but it's not nearly enough. Like, when you compare active listings today to what they were 5 or even 10 years ago, I mean, we're at a fraction of the amount of active listings as there were in 2012, 2013, 2014. And so that really puts a floor on, like, how low prices can go. We need more inventory to balance out the supply and demand, which then leads into these other questions of, like, okay, well, how do we get more inventory if sellers are not in positions where they're forced to sell, and they're certainly not going to sell their house at a loss or for less than what their neighbors sold for? Because let's be honest, the resale market it's a financially inefficient market. Like, most home sellers are doing so for emotional reasons. At least right now, and in this economy, most are not forced sales. So it's unlikely that we're going to see a flood of available resale homes, which means that we need more building. And there have been some really good books and publications even on this. There's a book titled Build, Baby, Build. And the whole premise on that book is that, if we can just deregulate building, then free market capitalism is going to figure all this out. Builders are going to build like crazy and meet the housing demand issues, and that will bring some equilibrium to the supply-demand dynamics and ultimately bring housing prices down. But I think that a lot of that may be overly optimistic. Nevertheless, if there were three things that I think need to happen for housing to become more affordable, here's what they are: zoning, regulations, and addressing the elephant in the room, the socially awkwardness of talking about affordable housing, also known as NIMBYism. So let's start with the first one: zoning. Zoning, it really refers to housing density, is what I have in mind here. And the way that cities have the land divided, subdivided, parceled out, zoned, it makes it very difficult to increase housing density in most cities. Now, big cities are trying to figure out ways around this, but you had a lot of homes that were built in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that are like 12, 13, 1400 square foot homes that are on a quarter acre lot. And while that is awesome, like who wouldn't want to have more property, more space? It's not a very efficient use of land. And when these lots are zoned to only be a single family home as it is, there's really nothing then that can be done to increase the housing supply in those cities apart from developing new land. And then when you start to talk about developing new land, well, you still run into zoning issues, because oftentimes, as we look at undeveloped land, that's going to be more on the outskirts of the city, which sometimes can be zoned for low density, oftentimes rather is zoned as low density housing. And so then you have to go through all of the hoops of getting the land rezoned, subdivided, and then, of course, all of the development costs. So zoning is a huge issue. I have seen some encouraging trends, like Washington State is one that I think has really been a leader when it comes to housing affordability. They've had some really good ideas. And they just passed some legislation last year that made it so really any city with a population of over 75,000 people in wherever you're at in Washington State, every city had to adopt new zoning codes that would allow for every homeowner in cities of those size to have up to 2 ADUs on their property. So you could convert a detached garage, or you could convert a basement into an ADU. ADU is short for additional dwelling unit or auxiliary dwelling unit. You could build a tiny home or something like that in your backyard, and then you could use that property either, one, as a rental property, creating more housing through renting, or, interestingly, you could condominiumize essentially your ADUs, where you would have to put together like a common interest property and statement, essentially an HOA, but that you would be able to have like your primary unit as unit one, your house, and then you could have your detached ADU as unit two, and you would be able to sell unit two separate from your primary residence, which is really cool for one, as a homeowner, maybe a really great way to financially benefit from your property without having to move, but also a great way to create more affordable housing and answer this question of housing density. So I do think there's some really creative things that can be done from a zoning perspective. But zoning is the number one barrier to creating more affordable housing. Another piece of that too is city zoning and how high you can build up and what that means. It's not just building out horizontally, but also the limitations on building up and vertically, and what that limits in terms of other sort of housing supply when it comes to potentially condos or townhomes or different things like that. So zoning is something that if we care about affordable housing, we've got to take a much closer look at. Now, zoning also leads us into my second concern, which is regulations. I mentioned, it kind of is implied as we think about zoning and developing land that is more on the outskirts of desirable cities and suburbs. Well, if those areas are deemed as low density and need to be rezoned, the regulatory processes to get those kind of zoning changes and then to subdivide and then to actually develop the land are both time and cost prohibitive. And an example of this is many city permitting offices are just incredibly backed up and so inefficient. Locally, I know of one city that's about 20 minutes from me, and for just for building a new home, it was taking 4 to 5 months from the time that the builder would apply for the permit to when the city would actually approve the permits and get them back to the builder. And that's for building a house. Like after all of the infrastructure and initial ground development has been done, the process takes even longer when you're actually having to look at environmental and impact on a community by adding a whole new development and subdivision, and what that means for schools and sewer and public water and sidewalks and traffic. Yes, there's a lot that cities have to consider, but if it takes them 12, 18, 24 months to actually approve these plans, well, that is extremely costly for land developers because it drags out their holding costs, the time between when they first purchase a property and when they can actually turn around and make money from it to pay all of the people that they employ to do the work. So just the time piece alone is a massive, massive issue that I get it. Like these city offices, county offices, they're short staffed, they need more people, but hopefully this is an area where with the advent of AI technology, we can find some more efficient ways to get things through the permitting process so that there's a lot less turnaround time from initial project proposal to when ground is actually being broken and development is underway. But there's also huge costs. It's not just the time. Because if you think about, let's just take a 1 acre parcel, because the easy math, right? Like if you were to have a 1 acre parcel and then you needed to have the environmental studies and impact studies, let's just say that that's $50,000 to just for those 2 studies for the 1 acre. Well, that's great. That's $50,000 one time. Now, interestingly, if you subdivide that lot so that now you have 4 quarter-acre lots, well, guess what happens with those impact and environmental fees? They multiply by 4. So instead of just $50,000, now you're looking at $200,000 in fees for the exact same lot functionally. But it's a way that, again, because cities are short-staffed and underwhelmed and oftentimes on the verge of financial ruin, they see this as an opportunity whenever there's subdivision and development. this is their payday. This is how they make their ends meet. And so they are looking for every possible way to extract every dollar they can from developers and builders, which, of course, where do those costs ultimately go? Well, they go to the end buyer, the person who is purchasing the home. And ironically, then, the more the house sells for, partially inflated because of these regulatory fees. The more the house sells for, the higher the property taxes are, which again leads to the city making more money. So housing is huge when it comes to local governments, counties having the sort of income that they need. But it's also just this vicious cycle because it's one of the largest barriers to housing affordability and one of the biggest reasons why a builder simply cannot build a house for $300,000 anymore. If you've got a $50,000 just impact fee alone on the lot, and that's not even counting the hookups to sewer and water and electric and grading and then the actual construction of a house, like you're not going to be able to do it for 300 grand. So we've got to take a closer look at regulations. We also really do need to think about building code and the different standards that are being expected there, which is a funny thing to say, right? Like, who doesn't want the highest standards when it comes to construction? I get that. But also, we have to realize that there is the building code committees and people within the local governments making these decisions, that it's like it is their job every year to come up with new things to push the ball forward. But as with anything in life, you've got the law of diminishing returns. And so you're creating more and more regulations, raising the standards higher and higher, which then have outsized cost relative to the return that they bring. Like, we are over engineering homes. There, I said it. We are over engineering homes, or at least the standards for them are getting too high and therefore too expensive, which just makes affordability, again, a real challenge. And one of the ironies in all of this is that who's really pushing for more regulations? Who wants higher energy efficiency standards and higher expectations on builder materials and the costs there? Well, the people who stand to gain the most are the United States' largest builders, because these publicly traded companies, I'm not meaning to just corporate bash here, but that's the reality, is that these are publicly traded companies. And because of their economies of scale, they truly are able to absorb the cost and adapt whenever there are these changes in regulation. And these regulations then hurt the local builders, the ones that are actually doing the most for their local economies, who know the area best. And so it's really the D.R. Hortons and Lennars of the world that are pushing for greater regulation as a means of largely diminishing their competition, making it harder for their competition. And ultimately, that is not what's in the best interest of housing affordability. So regulations are something that we've got to take a closer look at. And like him or not, this is not a statement, negative or positive, about the Trump administration. But one of the things that Trump has been clear on is that he wants to look very closely. He wants his administration to look very closely at regulations. Now, most of these regulations, like zoning, are happening at a state and county, even city level. But there may still be some pressure that the federal government can apply on more local municipalities to let up on regulations to make it easier, more efficient, more affordable for builders to actually build. Now, one of the things, and this idea actually came from Rob Hahn, who is one of the most brilliant minds in real estate. I really appreciate Rob Hahn. But one of his ideas on regulations was that when builders sell a house, they should be able to have a caveat where they say, hey, here's the price of the home. $300,000. And here are the costs of government regulation, $250,000. So, of your $550,000 home, 300 of it is actually what we're charging as the builder, and $250,000 is what you're giving to your local government because of their requirements to build the house here. And that kind of transparency might be really good for, at least from a consumer perspective, because you would have a much clearer picture of like, oh, this isn't just greedy builders. Like there are real forces, fixed costs that are set by the government that we've got to figure out. Now, will local governments ever allow for that? Would they penalize builders that tried to do something? Probably. They don't want that kind of transparency, and they don't want to take that kind of heat because, again, like they're desperate to bring in money, and this is just one of the most obvious ways how. But I really like that idea of Rob Hahn's, and I hope that it's kind of like how at fast food restaurants now, they've got to advertise the number of calories in a meal, or even like on the dealer MSRP sheet, and you see all of the different things that add to the price of the car. I would just love if there was like a government regulatory sticker price that just said, hey, this is what the government has added to the cost of your home. And that would probably get people talking and trying to make change. But the final piece here is a very human piece. And this is something that I think we all need to evaluate ourselves in. And that is the way that we talk about affordable housing is really stigmatized, right? Like, in a way, everybody likes the idea of affordable housing, wants to be for affordable housing. Anybody who's buying a home wants for homes to be more affordable, whether this is your forever home or fourth, fifth home, whether it's your first home, it doesn't matter. Housing affordability, when you're buying, you're thinking about it. But when we talk about housing density, when we talk about changing regulations and making pathways for more affordable housing, that's where we get a lot of the classic NIMBYism, which is short for not in my backyard, right? Like, I am all about affordable housing as long as it is over there on the other side of town, way far away from me, where I don't have to see it or smell it or be part of it. Like it is quite the stigma around affordable housing. And so, one, this is just something that we need to address culturally. We need to realize, for anybody who has been privileged to own a home, especially if you have great equity in your home, you have to recognize that some of the fortune that you've had is just the incredible luck of the draw circumstantially. And hopefully that creates some degree of compassion for others that have not been able to get onto and climb the housing ladder as you have been able to. Like, if you've been able to build incredible equity home after home after home, it makes it so much easier than if you've never owned a home and you're trying to jump in now when houses are historically never been harder to afford. So we should cultivate some compassion for those folks. And try and think about ways of just like, okay, yeah, we should be supportive then of zoning changes that are going to create ADUs that can be condominiumized so that somebody can, somebody who's in their mid to late 20s working a good job and just wants to own a house, that there's a good option at $250,000 for them to be able to buy and to be able to start climbing that housing ladder, just as so many others of us have been fortunate to do. So that's one piece. I think that there's another piece too, where we just got to get more creative and not just calling affordable housing. There's a project not too far from where I'm at, just outside of the Portland, Oregon area, where they're creating what they're calling a walkable community. It's a community where there's hardly any parking, and because they're not having to think about parking and driveways and garage spaces, because it's a walkable community, that means that there's a lot more land that can be developed that doesn't have to be dedicated to cars and vehicles. Instead, we can have more living space with that square footage. And everybody wants to live in a walkable community with community amenities like preschools and senior care and cafes and a gym. And so it's cool to see these projects that are popping up. And because there's higher density, a lot of these are smaller homes. They are, as a consequence, more affordable options, but they're not pitched and marketed as affordable houses. And I think that that's a helpful thing that developers, builders, and that kind of all of us need to get into our vernacular is how do we think of get away from the stigmas that we have around affordable housing and actually get excited about creating communities like this, even amid our existing communities where they're cool new models of community living, where just as a consequence, by nature of the way the community is designed, houses are more affordable to build and therefore more affordable to buy. So these are the three biggest pieces. And of course, once you pick up one and start to look at it, you realize that there's, a chain link of other attached issues. And so I'm not saying that it's as simple as fixing these three things, but at least these are three categories that we really have to start thinking about. My biggest concern or hesitation is that the government would do kind of what's the easy and lazy way, which is to just say, well, we'll just give all first-time home buyers a extra $10,000 or $15,000 down payment assistance. If we can just get them that down payment assistance, or if we can create some sort of program to give them more money to purchase a house. That sounds nice. It gets a lot of attention, a lot of votes, I'm sure. But it is a short-term fix and solution that actually perpetuates the housing problem that we have. By adding more money to home buyers' pockets to help them compete, it actually just is going to drive the cost of housing up higher and higher. And the more money that we print and create for that, the more it devalues the dollar. So it hurts on both sides. Houses get more expensive. The dollar is worth less. We've got to avoid going for the easy solution. And instead, we really do need to think in more long-term kind of ways. And the last sort of pessimistic piece that I will leave kind of here with is that it also means that for homeowners, I think you do need to expect that for housing to become more affordable, there has to be some price correction in the next few years. And I'm not talking crash, but I'm talking like a pretty significant 10, 15, even 20% price correction in some markets for houses to get back to any level of like reasonable affordability. I don't think that the answer is interest rates. Of course, that always has a bearing, but I would just love to see it get to the point like where, again, affordable housing being 3 times someone's annual income. And so if we can raise people's income through better opportunities so that the average household is bringing in closer to $100,000 a year. And if we can bring housing costs down so that there are really good options where families can buy homes for $300,000, I mean, that would be really the ideal, the sweet spot. Now, is it too idealistic? you got to let me know. But this is something that I'm wanting to have more conversations about with the people around me, and just hoping that by getting these ideas out and into the air and having discussions like this, that these ideas will catch the right ears, and ultimately the right changes will be made, so that our communities are better for everybody. That's the goal, right? We're seeking the common good here. So if there's anything that resonates in this episode, I'd love to know in the comments. Let me know what you think. If there's anything here where you're like, I want to have this conversation with others, please do share the episode. That is so helpful when it comes to connecting with other good people. And so I really appreciate everybody that you share the episode with. Short of that, subscribing to the show, leaving a review, giving 5-star, whatever it looks like, whatever platform that you're on, just lets me know that you're out there and that I should keep creating this kind of stuff. And so please, I'm grateful for anything that you do to just say, hey, Nick, keep it up. I am grateful for you all. Do connect with me. There's the free DIY homebuyer group on School. So skool.com/DIY homebuyer. Come hang out with me and the other fine DIY homebuyers there. Learn how to buy a home without having to hire a buyer's agent. And of course, if you want to talk about anything further, you find all my contact info, all my socials in the description below. Thanks, everybody. Catch you in the next one.